Hello. Today is February the 21st. It's Pisces season, and I actually got a Facebook memory coming up on my feed today that it was posting about the first ever natal chart reading that I did for an internet friend that I didn't know in real life, but it's just a internet natal chart reading with the sake of practicing to learn astrology. And that was February 21st, 2017. And so it's been a whole 6 years now since 2017 since I started learning astrology. So it kind of marks the 6 year mark of my astrology practice. And I have to admit I've hit some bumps in the road, namely that I was trying to like rev up and go really hard, and then I ended up hitting basically a wall when I had to deal with a housing change of situation, and I was ideally wanting to set myself up in a house where I could live independently and have a kind of identity as an astrologer, as a job, and I could get kind of the ball rolling and doing readings for people. But the thing about that was that well, I don't know. I couldn't find the housing market sucks basically for one thing, and whether or not I don't know whether or not the be having. Some people are able to do it, which is encouraging, anyways, right? And that I have friends that are professional astrologers who are more established, and that it's encouraging that it's a possibility. However, I basically hit a wall, and whatever. I'm talking about this though. I'm getting distracted by my own personal issues of having an unsuccessful astrology practice. I'm saying I hit a wall with housing, round up my mom's house, and lost confidence, and then had a autoimmune disorder flare up, which was very serious and put me in the hospital, and I almost died. And I ended up trying to do astrology after that, basically, but I wasn't able to attract very many clients in the climate that was around. And also, there's certain things about political issues and about what maybe if I had the same political beliefs as because I know that some astrologers are really anti-vax or something, and I don't even know what to think, because maybe the vax contributed to my health problems, maybe it didn't have an effect, maybe it was just the stress, I don't know, but I'm kind of confused about the whole COVID thing. I don't know where to stand, but I feel that the people that are there's a lot of weird politics around it, right? But I don't want to get too caught up in that right now. The main thing though is that I've been using this period of time. I managed to finish reading Cosmos and Psyche finally, and that I was been making astrology videos where I also like reading a lot of philosophy and stuff like this, and I'm trying to. There's certain tensions. There's certain things where I have to admit I was kind of maybe a bit harsh with Richard Tarnas, because in this other video I was talking about trying to resolve my interest in Deleuzian kind of postmodern, post-structuralist philosophy with my interest in astrology, and that there's a sort of thing about that kind of post-structuralist move that they're like that Tarnas and Groff are all about seeking wholeness, right? The whole holotropic breathwork, it's all about wholeness, but they see the postmodernism as being always trying to prevent wholeness. And I don't think it's necessarily preventing wholeness, but dealing with the all the weird stuff that's kind of happened in the 20th century, just the historical moment that we're in, and why that if we're supposed to have the point that they always try to get at with, I find anyways, the holotropic psychedelic thing is that the principle is that wholeness is going to bring us to this point where the imbalances are going to be corrected, and things are going to be realigned and give birth to a golden new age dawn of, utopian society, and everything will be resolved. But what seems to happen is that our process of conscious development hits these sort of tensions, and it explodes open into like nuclear bombs and conflict and stuff like, and it's sort of like we're not the whole point of it's I don't think it's the postmodernists that did that. What I'm trying to say, the postmodernists are just the people who want to be like, why is this happening? Let's take a look at it. Let's make sure that we should be careful about what we're doing and think about it rather than take this really simplistic approach that just, explodes everything open into a kind of millenarian apocalypse, or whatever, right? Like, which kind of seems like maybe World War II is a bit like that almost, right? But anyways, Cosmos and Psyche, what can I say? This is an interesting 5-minute introduction to talking about Cosmos and Psyche, but this is just where my head is at today, I guess. I thought that it would be good to make a video about Cosmos and Psyche, because like I was saying in my other video, I already sort of I feel like it was unfair perhaps to just dive into bringing up that kind of the postmodern tension with Rick Tarnas, that instead we should basically look at Cosmos and Psyche just on its own and assess, or not really assess it, but this is basically my take on it. Because one of the things I have to admit is that I have been friendly online talking with Ren Butler, who is a astrologer, who's also a Canadian guy, and he seems like a really nice guy, and he's encouraged me to take his class. And then, but I was almost going to do it, and then I had this health problem happen. I thought like, oh, I don't know, I'm kind of sick. Maybe I'll be over it in a couple weeks or something. And I was like on the verge of death. I thought I would be. It was a lot. I don't know. I maybe have a way of whatever. I don't know. My optimistic Sagittarius attitude is maybe somewhat in denial when I'm like almost going to die or something. I don't know what the deal is, but it was more of a serious health problem than I would have. Whatever. I survived. I'm good now though, and but these sort of obstacles have interrupted that kind of stuff. But there's certain things that I had hesitation though about getting completely on board with Rick Tarnas, because I had been already established myself with working with Adam Ellenboss, and that, to be honest, that I just sort of find it where it's like there's a lot. The problem with astrology that I find is that it's very saturated with lots of astrologers, and I kind of have this thing where I just like Adam Ellenboss's style, and it's sort of like I don't really. I kind of want to maybe take classes from other astrologers too, but I feel like I have to start from, well, I mean, whatever. They're doing a different stuff though. That the archetypal astrology is kind of approaching different sides of it, or there's different things that maybe you would get out of it that you wouldn't get out of just taking a traditional Hellenistic astrology course, right? But it's interesting in the recent climate of what's been going on in the astrology world. We've recently had, around the time we had this thing with like Mercury, Pluto, in Capricorn and all this, we had Chris Brennan kind of launch a counterattack against Deborah Holding, right? Which I find is kind of funny, because I've been talking in my postmodern perspective about the castles, and it's almost like fortifications, or if astrologers build up their little castles, and now like the ones who don't like the different house systems attack each other in a very military. And it's kind of funny with the whole like whatever Alan White being the Vietnam vet guy from there's this militaristic imperial, like we're generals, and now we'll elect now a time to go and attack our enemies, and we'll flank out and we'll take over the astrology. It's like the takeover. Because I actually like Chris Brennan, and that's the way I do my astrology. So it's kind of fun because it feels like your team has just conquered the whole astrology world. But on the other hand, it's kind of like, it has me thinking that, maybe there's an issue here about the direction, because there's another friend of mine who I think maybe is more into the community than I am, because before this blew up, I saw some posts going around about the issues, about squabbling about the details about house systems, and the being really making astrology like there's I'm not against the scholarly approach to astrology, but there's something about, as I started, at first I was like, oh man, we've got these live streams going, and we've got Rob Hand, and we've got Demetra George, and it's like a full on thing. But like as I got into it, it wasn't that long before it dawned on me that having 6 hours of arguing about whole sign house system or also just like you have to admit that part of the problem was that Deborah Holding's argument wasn't very good to begin with, so it was basically a bunch of petty bullshit. So, I'm sorry, but that's it wasn't a very well built. The whole thing wasn't, the issue isn't even which which house system works. It's the issue is what's the historical basis? What is the most historically accurate or historically relevant way to talk about the way that astrology developed, and that the way that different house systems were introduced and came out of the practice, and which as there's this kind of bias though that the way that the ancient Greeks did it, the older it is, the necessarily is the better, and that there's a argument to be made that like to it's one thing to argue about the historical validity, but then it's a different argument to say, hey, well, I can still use a different house system just because the ancient Greeks didn't use that house system. I can still use a different house system just because, it's not, but, and then it depends on what techniques you're using it with and all this kind of stuff. But I have to, where I'm taking all this, I'm not just rambling meaninglessly here. I have a point that I'm trying to make, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that another thing that comes up when you're an astrologer is the skepticism towards astrology, right? And then about Cosmos and Psyche, I feel is that it was interesting because Tarnas comes from a background that isn't just being an astrologer. He comes from being a respected academic, and so it's almost a bit controversial in a way that I don't really know. I'm not much of an academic myself, so I don't know exactly what kind of standing he has, but I know that in some courses, his other books may be recommended, that people take him seriously, and that it's maybe a bit even risky for a guy like him to put so much of his stake in astrology. So it's actually kind of cool that a guy who's established himself as a guy who's taken seriously and can get into astrology like this, and then write a book because he's into with such a level of historical insight, right, to look at all the different historical developments, and that there are certain things he's pointed out, especially when you consider that he wrote this book before COVID happened, and he wrote this book. There's a certain historical moment where he made some predictions, and if you look at the predictions he made for Saturn and Pluto, and the predictions, there's a very uncanny, definitely if you're interested in astrology, it's essential to read, and that he's made a name for himself in the astrology scene for a reason, and so that's the whole thing. Is I don't want to be unfair to Rick Tarnas by just making this other video where I was trying to stand up for my own postmodern Deleuzian inclinations and make a argument for spinning astrology into a weird kind of new direction based on my own kind of creative process, but addressing basically some of the resistances that are already there to doing that. But first saying that, coming back now, first of all saying that I do like this book and that he's done great work and it's worth checking out. And however, that doesn't mean that there's also some criticisms against it, right? But as I'm going to go with this, I was introducing this point about the skepticism, right? And that one of the things about this book is that it's kind of written in a way where if you didn't know anything about astrology at all, and you were like a rational academic kind of guy, he's kind of introducing the point to you, right? He's trying to introduce somebody who's been living in a world that is disenchanted to a kind of a magical cosmos where the stars are imparting messages and signs and it all is filled with meaning and stuff, right? So he's trying to a lot of this is trying to introduce you and then showing you through history and stuff like this how it's relevant and stuff. However, I have to admit, there's certain things. Like, if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of, trying to convince a skeptic or not, this is something that I've kind of shied away from because I personally, I kind of feel like if people are really skeptical, there's this urge of a skeptic to want to just debate or to criticize or to be dominant, and they actually not really interested in trying to consider the other point of view, and so I don't really try to seek out those kinds of debates or arguments or whatever. But if people are open-minded, I will at least approach some of these issues. And one of the issues that I basically I had this encounter with a guy that I was renting a place from, and he was a landlord, and then he ended up moving back in, so I was kind of living with my landlord, and there was a kind of interesting tension in whether or not him and his friends accepted astrology, or whether they thought it was a kind of a cheesy thing or not. But what I thought was really funny about this was that when the guy offered his resistance to astrology, that his basically, I mean, okay, I have to also admit the guy was, I don't want to make any ad hominem things, but the guy was a bit of a drinker, and I don't necessarily, like, there's a lot of the times where he had these sort of like funny, like, right-wing Trump supporter views, and he was he did not really seem like, I did not really respect his intelligence very much, I must say. I was kind of like, but he, the fun, because this is the thing though, his approach though to resisting astrology wasn't to say that he had any initial like the idea of astrology, right, is that you've got planets, you've got constellations, you've got the phenomena of the stuff that you see in the sky, and you've got stuff happening in your life, and you've got prediction and all this kind of stuff. His problem with astrology wasn't with any of that. His problem was like, so let me get this straight. So there's like, I mean, like, I don't know, I'm going to explain it with my own language, because I don't know how this guy, I wouldn't be able to put it in his words, right? But his issue with it was that, okay, so there's the precession of the equinoxes, right? So that in ancient Greece, when they first made astrology 2,000 years ago, or when it was formulated by the you know, you could also say it's farther back than that, the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians, and anyways, way back when they formulated it, that there's a kind of a drift in the constellations where that the zero Aries point, which marks the equinox, is off now by, let's say, I don't know how many, what's the actual, is it 10 degrees or something? It's not very much. It's less than one sign anyways. It could be about half a sign, which would be 15 degrees. So basically, it's the specific problem with why astrological divination is, this particular guy had a problem with it, was because the precession of the equinox creates a 15-degree difference that affects tropical astrology and sidereal astrology, creating a different system, which is actually relevant if you think about what we call Vedic astrology. And the thing is, to be honest, Vedic astrology is kind of just a white guy term for Indian astrology, because in India they don't call it Vedic astrology, they just call it astrology, and then they call whatever those white guys are doing as well, you know, so the other astrology, right? For them it's just astrology, and they're Indians, and this is astrology, right? So if you go, the Indian guys use the sidereal system, and if I was to do the Indian tradition, right, then this thing happens where I look at the placement of the planets and I look at the placement of the constellations, but what defines the sign relationship to the planet is dependent on this factor, which changes due to, you know, astrology is drifting over thousands of years, right? And so the precession of the equinoxes creates two systems, basically. You've got Indians using one system, and you've got Western people using the other. There actually is a lot of similarities between them. The planets, basically, the meaning of the planets is fundamentally the same in both systems. The meaning of the signs but it's confusing, though, because all of a sudden, now, where I'm a Sagittarius sun in one system, I'm a Scorpio sun in the other system, right? And so it's kind of, it creates this is the whole problem. And then, as a philosopher, the issue when we get into what we call cultural subjectivity, right? Which is, cultural subjectivity is that we're trying to, the idea that astrology is something where the planets represent something that, think about how many civilizations have come and gone, that we've had not only the Roman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Mongol hordes, the, you know, Genghis Khan, and you know, the Alexander the Great, and the blah 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 blah, you know, all these different empires and their own subjective perspective and their own subjective ways of doing things. And in this system of astrology, the planets are supposed to represent something that is a lot more constant than the little petty lives of human beings. Like, the idea is that you might have a tortoise as an animal that lives 100 years, and then you have fruit flies that only live a day or something, like a mosquito or something like that, butterfly or something, that only live that, but they're still life forms, right? They're still life forms anyways. But the idea that a planet in a sense, is like a life form. It's like a being. Maybe it's not alive in the same way that we are, but in a sense, it's an object. It's a being, and it inhabits a temporal reality. And it has a big, like, there's one point in time where these planets didn't exist, they were created and stuff like this, but they represent things which have durations much larger than ours. And this is what I was trying to get with my idea of Bergsonian astrology, right? Is that, and also Deleuzian astrology, is that you can make a Bergsonian Deleuzian astrology work by focusing on durations and velocities and speeds and the intensities, right? And different different with it, rather than, and the whole thing about whatever, you can, rather than making it necessarily about being in detriment or whatever, you could have different forms of intensity, but then it kind of gets vague, right? But you can just, you don't have to make it all like that. You can keep all those designations and still be Deleuzian if you want. You don't have to deconstruct everything. But I'm kind of getting distracted with my Deleuzian riffs. Rick Tarnas, where am I going with this? The precession of the equinoxes, and so anyways, yeah, the cultural subjectivity is in the two systems. Is that what I notice about Rick Tarnas and Cosmos and Psyche, is that he doesn't talk about signs at all in this, right? And that kind of upset me, because for me, like, another thing that kind of irks me about Rick Tarnas, despite all the good things, is that he ended up inventing his own kind of astrology, and he called it archetypal astrology, right? And the thing is, what's a good example? Never mind. They're pulling out random books or something. But the archetypal psychology, right? Archetypal astrology. Just think about James Hillman, who has archetypal psychology, right? That's the whole thing about, like, somebody like Hillman can go around and make something called archetypal psychology, and that even Tarnas, he writes about Hillman, right? And he make his own archetypal astrology. But the thing is that, like, aside from being called archetypal, that what both Hillman and Tarnas are doing are, in my mind, very different things, right? And that they do have a contact with each other, and they are in conversation with each other. But using the word archetypal to describe both Hillman's psychology as well as Rick Tarnas's astrology, to me, it doesn't really mean very much, especially if you consider that you're talking about astrology, and if you're contrasting what is branded as archetypal astrology with other kinds of astrology, it implies that would be somehow more archetypal, or that these other kinds of astrology, what they deal with are, they deal with signs and houses and planets and things but they're not archetypes. That, like, the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac aren't archetypes, but the planets are, right? But the thing, there's this thing about it, though, that there is true that on some level that the signs themselves are all derivative of the planets, where Aries is a Mars sign, and in the traditionally Scorpio is also a Mars sign, because each planet had a male and a female, or a yin and a yang, right? And that also goes with, I don't as much as there's certain issues with the outer planets, and that's one of them. I do still like keeping the traditional significations. But there's this whole thing, though, that in archetypal psychology, that all goes out the window. And what I'm guessing, anyways, is why I brought up this guy's story about the precession of the equinoxes and the two systems of sidereal and tropical, is that what's interesting is, for a lot of people, their skepticism of astrology doesn't actually have anything to do about the skepticism of divination as a process. Their skepticism is just like, yeah, but there's two systems. So, like, if the Indians are divining one system, and the white guys, the Westerners, are defining another system, they're going to say completely different things, right? Because they're using completely. I mean, but the funny thing is that they're so close that they're almost the same, but in these critical ways they're different. That it's going to be a thing where you're going to have to choose which system you're going to use, and then whatever system you're going to use is going to give you a completely different divination. and then you have to commit to that, because if you were to somehow there's some people who want to resolve the differences and make a hybrid but usually that just means that we're going to be like, there's people who are going to be like, I'm going to do Vedic astrology with a tropical zodiac, or I'm going to do a Western whatever. I'm going to do Hellenistic astrology with a sidereal zodiac. But it's kind of funny because you're just kind of taking different things from different systems and then mashing them into and like switching them around rather than being true to what everybody in that tradition is doing. And so that's kind of, but that in itself is a kind of a Deleuzian thing, whether you want to do, that's your move. I don't even know if that's a good thing or not, right? But there's certain, like, who's to stop you if that's what you want to do? If you want to be like, I'm going to take Hellenistic astrology and then just implant a sidereal zodiac, there's probably a lot of people that would cringe if you did that, because Robert Hand in an interview says, you know, once you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. Like, you can't if you're going to go Vedic all the way. Don't like borrow all these Vedic things and then implant it into tropical astrology. But then people kind of end up doing that anyways, unfortunately. Like, it's kind of, eventually you're looking into trying to understand how what is it? Like the eclipses and stuff work, and you're like, there's not really that much about what the North Node is about, but if we go to Vedic, there's all this North, so then you're like, okay, we're not going to put anything, we're going to keep them separate, but we're going to go to Vedic and get all our stuff from the North Node from Vedic, and then, you know, and mix that in, and then do all this yoga stuff, and then it ends up being as a mishmash anyways, right? Even if you're trying to keep it, like, we're going to be just pure Hellenistic astrology, but we're going to, you know, do retreats in India at the same time. There's no way around it. It's just going to happen probably, right? But the thing about the Tarnas approach anyways is that I think the strategy, I don't know if he even explains this explicitly in the book, because it's taken me so long to read this book. I can't remember I don't think he explicitly says that's why he doesn't talk about the zodiac signs, but by just leaving the zodiac signs out, it creates a situation where you only have planets to work with, and then when you only have planets to work with, the guy who says, well, wait a minute, what about like, you've got this precession of the equinoxes, and that's different wherever, and there might be a 13th sign of the zodiac, you know, if they're really annoying, they'll bring up that one. Don't even go there, right? Like, that's just obnoxious. But the all that bullshit, essentially, pardon my language, is resolved if you just say, okay, we're not going to worry about the planets, we're not going to worry about the zodiac, we're just going to talk about planets, and we're going to planetary alignments. You don't need a zodiac for that. You can see when Jupiter and Saturn are conjunct in the sky. You don't even need a telescope. You just go outside and you can see a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And so all these naturalistic, you know, there's these naturalist people who are like, well, I don't want, you know, and well, hold on, I don't want to make fun of them either, because there's something I can see about what's going on with Chris Brennan and what's going on with the whole Sign House controversy is that the question is, not to say that it's completely irrelevant, and I do actually like whole sign houses, and if I was going to do a reading for someone, I'd be using Chris Brennan's method, and I'd be implementing that system, because that's the one I like. But do we want to make our relationship to astrology about having 6-hour sessions where you're just binging out, arguing about like pedantic details about, you know, the nitty gritty? Because unfortunately that's a lot of the direction the astrology ends up going, when you're taking it at that kind of a level. And the thing about what I like about Rick Tarnas is that it's not that it's not academic, it's not that it's not, it's just that you can direct your process of where you're exploring astrology in a direction that doesn't have to be the same as Project Hindsight. It's not to say that I don't like, because I find the Project Hindsight stuff really interesting, but it's like, astrology doesn't have to be completely dominated by exactly how did Vedius Valens do everything exactly, you know what I mean? And like, and being like, I mean, you could do it if you want to. I'm not saying you don't have to, but you could there's this whole other direction you can take it, where we're not going to think about the planetary dignities at all. It doesn't even matter what sign the planet's in. It doesn't even matter. We can just say that, look, there's the sun, there's the moon, there's two planets conjunct, and we don't even need to telescope. We don't even need a chart. We can just see planets as naturalistic phenomenon. And there's something about that which grounds it into this objective. You lose all the cultural subjectivity, and now you've actually got an objective thing that you can't argue with. You can't argue that there's I don't believe that the planets are conjunct. No, look at them. They're right there. It's like can you believe your eyes? There's two planets conjunct. It takes out all the uncertainty, and you can deal with a brute fact of two planets conjunct, and you don't have to fuss about whether whether the Indians are going to say this is in Libra or Scorpio. But the problem is I actually all the others then you lose all that stuff. And do you want to lose the 12 signs of the zodiac? Do you really want to lose all the tradition of astrology just so you can prove to some facts and logic bros who have a problem with the nuances of cultural subjectivity that they need to have some sort of iron logic objectivity in order to make their divination work? That's I don't know. And that's just one of the problems. There is another issue here, too. We're at half an hour. Part two, another issue, another problem. In spite of everything that's good about Rick Tarnas, there's one issue. Also, this whole problem about the focus on the outer planets. And this is the whole... Then we get into this other thing, though, about the tension between traditional astrology and modern astrology. And I do use the outer planets in my astrology. And I'm going to basically just address some of the problems with it, right? Okay. First of all, there's the discovery of the planet Uranus, which when it was discovered, it wasn't even named Uranus. That the astronomer who discovered it wanted to name it, King George or whatever, after the king at the time. And then eventually they decided to name it Uranus. But in Rick Tarnas' book, he makes this kind of argument that to understand Uranus, it made more sense to look at the myth of Prometheus, right, as being a kind of revolutionary, liberating kind of thing, right? And Uranus, I think it works in this kind of way, but there's certain questions though, like if it works so much to use the Prometheus myth for Uranus, why didn't we just call it Prometheus? Why? What's up with the naming process with these planets? What is the significance of naming this planet Uranus? Why do we have to use the Prometheus myth rather than the Uranus? Not saying it doesn't work though, but isn't this kind of there's something problematic here about it? There's also what I think is interesting is that if you don't go with the Prometheus route, this is just a random idea that I had, right? A random thought. Let's forget Prometheus for a second and actually look at the myth of Uranus. And the myth, Uranus was the sky god, and in the creation story of Greek mythology, the sky god was getting the nasty on with Mother Earth, and they're really going at it. Right? According to the story, I don't know how to put it. It's basically they weren't putting it in a way that was very. The Greeks were appreciating. There's something about that these two had to be wretched apart, and Saturn was the one who castrated Uranus, basically, in his move to separate the sky and the earth apart, and the idea of our metaphysical landscape of the horizon, right? Of the horizon, which is important to astrology, right? Because the horizon marks the ascendant and descendant. So there's actually, the myth of Uranus is actually very important to the whole where the whole astrological system comes from, in a way. But I don't really hear people talking about that part of it that much, right? But what's interesting is that out of this, you also have major astrological characters in this story, with Saturn being the one who castrates Uranus, right? And then Uranus also being in the zodiacal order, the one that comes after Saturn. And also there's this thing that the modern astrologers try to stick it into Saturn's sign, we want to give Uranus back his Uranus has been we're going to give Uranus his balls back by giving him Aquarius or something. I mean, that's the mentality, right? But the Uranus has been castrated by Saturn, and then out of this, though, out of the split between Uranus and Mother Earth comes Venus, actually, right? Because that's the story, the Venus creation story, is that Venus emerged out of a clamshell after the Gaia and Uranus have been split apart. And so that Venus is actually the child of Uranus, which is, I find interesting, because when you look at the story that modern astrologers usually weave about whatever the outer planets are, they take Uranus and then they use this octave theory where octave theory is basically, if you read about the fixed stars, people will often use planets to describe fixed stars and say that this star is kind of like a bit like Saturn and a bit like Jupiter with add a bit of Venus. Or, they'll just be like, what is it like? Well, if you're painting with colors, you take a bit of this and take a bit of this, and that and the star has this kind of color because it's kind of like that, and so it's kind of like this one, and it's kind of like that. That's what they do to describe what fixed stars are like, right? So in that sense, they can see that it's like a lot of people are trying to describe what Uranus is like, and they say that Uranus is like Mercury, that it's like Uranus is like Mercury on steroids, or Uranus is like the Pokemon that has evolved to Mercury, like Mercury is a Pokemon that evolves and becomes Uranus. But if you actually look at the myth, it's not that Mercury, that Thoth, the messenger, evolves as a Pokemon and transforms and becomes Uranus. What happens is Uranus is an original kind of creator force that gives birth to Venus. So it's not that Mercury evolves into Uranus. It's that the Venus actually comes from Uranus, right? So it's like that Venus is something that evolves out of Uranus, actually, right? So it's like they got it all mixed up and backwards. Is that Venus is actually something that evolves from Uranus, and Uranus is a more primordial force than Venus, and Venus is actually pushing the evolution forward with harmonizing things and stuff, like, whereas Uranus is the initial burst forth of eureka, intuition, let's do this thing, and then Venus evolves it afterwards, right? It's a different way of looking at it. I don't know, this is just an idea I had, an alternative view for Uranus. It's more mythological, like playing with a name rather than doing this Prometheus stuff. But anyways, where am I going with this? The Rick Tarnas thing. The problem about the planet. So there's this whole thing about the discovery of Uranus and using Uranus as a planet and all this kind of thing. Now, the main issue about this, I've just been recording these videos and just putting them straight on YouTube. But for this one, I'm going to edit it in. I'm going to remember to edit in a picture and put it in here. And this picture is basically going to be the problem with the outer planets. Now, I have to admit, the thing is, I don't want to go around starting fights or anything like this, and I don't want to get into trouble with other astrologers, but I won't mention names, but there's another astrologer that I was talking to at some point in time, and I was just sort of like, it's one of these things where you're just kind of rubbing each other the wrong way. And then one of the things that I've always had an issue with the asteroids, I have to admit. Which is not to say that I don't think the asteroids don't work, because I often use Chiron is in my charts, and that I find that using Chiron is a really, it does work, right? And then on that principle, I'm sure that if you start using other asteroids as well, that I'm sure you could get some. It's like there's an issue of the traditional basis of astrology and astrological theory, and then whether or not experimental techniques work or whether new techniques work. And there's this whole issue too about the classification of planets and asteroids, which I ended up getting into a tizzy with. But it's like, I'm not, whatever. I've only been doing this for 6 years. I don't claim to be like a veteran astrologer, and I'm not that, whatever. I'm flexible in my views, right? And so I was looking into this, and the thing though is that the argument for what defines, we're going to talk about these three planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. The thing is, there's a lot of other objects in what they call the Kuiper belt. there's the Kuiper belt is further out. And I think the Kuiper belt is basically everything. They also call the trans-Neptunians, right? Like everything from Neptune. There's this whole area around Neptune and Pluto where there's a lot of objects floating around, right? And so this actually becomes an issue where if we are creating this picture that this is the whole problem about Cosmos and Psyche as just making a straight up criticism, or just even without even being invested as an astrologer. Okay, this is the whole thing. Also, in the whole tension between traditional astrology and modern astrology and using the outer planets is that in traditional astrology, the 7 planets, we can admit that there are a lot of objects in our solar system, but the 7 planets, as I mentioned before, when there's a Saturn and Jupiter conjunction, you can see it. You don't even need a telescope. You can see this Saturn and Jupiter conjunction. You don't need a telescope. You don't need astrology software. You don't need fancy calculation devices or techniques. You can just go out and see it as visual astronomical phenomena, and it's not complicated, right? But as soon as you get into Uranus, it's something that we only discovered once we had the technology to discover it, and there's all this other stuff that is available to us to be aware of, to be conscious of, but not in the most direct way as Jupiter and Saturn are, where you go out in, on a clear sky and just get bonked in the face with how bright Jupiter is, right? It doesn't happen with other planets. Or the whole effect, the idea that the naturalistic astrology, I think it's not just the idea that this thing is in a position as a morning star. Like when we say it matters that this planet's a morning star or an evening star. Now, does that matter? Like, if let's say Venus is a morning star, in the morning you can see Venus glowing and emitting the energy of Venus. Oh, look at Venus, she is so beautiful. Coming as the morning star. Right? There's something about Venus that's like that. But then, if you have just a random object that is dark that you can't see unless you have a sophisticated telescope and you have to be like in the elite astronomical community or something like this to know about all these details of all these different objects, like it's not the same thing as having Venus there, right, showing light to you. It's not the same thing at all. And the problem about the outer planets is there are a whole bunch of these objects, and when you look at what classifies Pluto, for example, there's the whole issue of whether Pluto is a planet or not. If the thing is, if you say that Pluto's a planet, there are certain other objects which are very, very similar to Pluto that there isn't really much of a reason. If Pluto's a planet, why not this be a planet? If Pluto's a planet, why not this be a planet? If Pluto's a planet, why not? And then you'd start doing that, and there are tons of these things. There's lots of them. There's lots of these objects out there, and which is not to say the whole point though is like, do we pretend that they don't exist? I mean, that's not the answer. Do we say that you can't do astrology with them? People are already doing astrology with them, But what I don't find, I have to admit, because I have this friend that, Lori, and she will just be like, if there's something about China in the news, she will look up, they named an asteroid after China, and now that you can use an asteroid named China to divine everything about China or something, or that anything you can think of, you can look up an asteroid that has that name, and then you can say there's a conjunction, and it's like, what's the basis of doing this? It's like playing Mad Libs where you pull out the fridge magnet poetry and say an asteroid, and you're just like, you don't have any idea of where the hell these asteroids are because there's so many of them, and you're just like, okay, well this one is there and it says this and this, and you spelling out whatever the fuck you want or whatever you think people will pay you for, that whatever you think sells, that is a nice story that people will pay you money for. You can just flop out your asteroid fridge magnet poetry and make your own reality. It's like, are you actually doing divination work is the question, right? Like, that's my issue with the asteroids, right? Not to be too harsh with it, but this is why I'm kind of a bit on the fence with the asteroid things. But the whole issue though is that Rick Tarnas is doing these things he's talking about all these major moments which are constellated to the exact positions of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto it being these precise alignments and all this kind of stuff. But the whole point, the problem is that if you could say that all these other objects are just as significant as Pluto, and he took him this long, he took him this huge project to write this huge book just on these 3 objects, and the whole issue is like, what makes Pluto so special? What makes Neptune so special? What makes Uranus so special? That these are the 3 that we use and treat them as if they're on par with Venus, on par with Mars, on par with Jupiter. Like, what makes those ones the ones that we want to use, and not Eris and Ceres and Juno and, you know, Pallas Athena and all these, like why don't we, you know? And then some people will say, oh, we do that too, right? And then, but it just becomes this, like, you know, it becomes a bit too, like, I don't know. You could, I mean, like the whole argument that it's like, there's also the argument that's just, you could do it all, but it just takes a lot of work, right? But if you look, and this is why I'm talking about this picture that I found that basically shows the kind of issue with how many of these damn objects there are. It's nuts. Like, what are you gonna do with all these things? It's great, like that. Okay. So that's that's kind of my issue with Cosmos and Psyche. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, maybe not that bad. It's still a good book, but I think I have some issues with, for one thing, making astrology. I can get the thing about putting a focus on planets rather than signs and making it objective, but then you lose the zodiac and you lose all this history and tradition of, like, you lose basically a lot of astrology by doing that. And then by putting all the focus on these outer planets, it's like, but what about Eris and Ceres and Juno and like the millions of other ones? I don't know how many there are. There are tons of these things. That is the issue. But and then the funny thing is, though, is that if you follow the astrology podcast, if you follow the transits, it does work. That's the weirdest thing about it, is that it does work. But is it just an illusion, right? And then we're going to have like a Neptune and Saturn conjunction now, right? Is that going to be more significant than if we have like a Neptune Ceres conjunction? Or I'm not even tracking these ones so closely, right? Or maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe we are going to be having these things, and I just haven't been paying close enough attention. But we've got like, you know, Chiron there with Jupiter and Venus right now, and all this kind of stuff. And when you're getting into that, like, it just becomes, there's this issue where if it takes so long to just write a book about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, then it takes so long, and there's all these things that we haven't even begun to investigate very much. I don't know. This is where that's kind of where I draw my line. I have to sort of, like, I don't know. You can see my concern or my criticism about that part of astrology. Anyways, okay. So this has been long enough. I'll wrap it up now. Thanks for watching.